Now, he's absolutely convinced me in chapter 3 of what's going to happen to me if I don't have that vital spiritual experience. He's convinced me that because of my insanity, that sooner or later, without the vital spiritual experience, the finding of the power, that I'll end up going back to drink again. Now, if you're the kind of alcoholic that I am, and if you were raised in the church setting that I was raised in, at the end of chapter 3, you would be faced with one hell of a dilemma. Because I knew I was going to have this vital spiritual experience, find this power greater than I am, God as I understand Him, but I also knew it was going to be impossible for me to do that. Because you see, I was raised also in a good old Southern Baptist church. Now, in a good old Southern Baptist church, I'm sure that when I was a kid growing up, they talked about a kind and a loving God. But if they did, that message never got to the pew I sat in. Because the only thing I ever heard about God as a kid growing up in church was hell, fire, and brimstone. That you go to hell for lying and cheating and stealing and drinking whiskey and committing adultery. And by the time I got to AA, I'd been doing that for 26 years. And I knew that God had already told St. Peter, when that little four-eyed sucker gets up here, send him downstairs. We'll not need his kind. Now, with that belief in my mind, then how in the world am I going to have a vital spiritual experience? I wonder how many people came to AA just like I did. Could I see your hands? Oh, yeah, look, a whole bunch of us. I remember when I really began to have trouble with this God thing. You know, growing up in church. Now, don't get me wrong. I love the Baptist church. Always have, and I guess I always will. But it seemed to me as though when I was growing up, as this young boy, they told me the things you can do and the things you can't do. They said, if you do this, this, and this, you'll be okay. If you do that, that, and that, you're going to go to hell just sure as anything. And I didn't have a bit of trouble with that till I got to be about 13 years old. And one day the minister looked me straight in the eye, and he said, to think about doing it is just as bad as doing it. And I thought, oh, crap, I've had it now. Because I'd been thinking about doing it for about a year. In fact, I've been thinking about doing it so bad I was beginning to get a little brain damage from it. And I thought, well, if you're going to go to hell for thinking about doing it, then you might as well go ahead and do it. And I did. And I didn't go to hell immediately. And I very distinctly remember saying to myself, that sucker has been lying to me all along, just to keep me from having fun. And from that day on, I made up my mind. I'll pay no attention to what the preacher says, no attention to what my parents say, no attention to what my teachers say. From this day on, it's going to go the way I want it to go, and I'm going to have fun, and they're not going to keep me from doing that. And I left that church completely, entirely. And I never really even thought much about God from the time I was 13 till the time I got here at age 40. And when I got here at age 40, I got here with the spiritual knowledge of a 12 or a 13-year-old boy. No wonder we have trouble with this spiritual side of this program whenever we start looking at this vital spiritual experience. And almost every alcoholic I talk to seems to have the same thoughts, the same feelings that I had and that Bill Wilson had. Thank God Bill Wilson is a real alcoholic, because he knew how I was going to think. And he knew that in order for me to be able to make the decision that I'm going to be called upon in just a little short period of time, that for me to make that decision, I'm going to have some new information. Because based on old ideas of hellfire and brimstone, there's no way I'm going to make a decision to turn my will and my life over to the care of that kind of God as I understood Him at that time. And he sat down and he wrote another little chapter, which I think is one of the greatest pieces of spiritual information I've ever read in my life. And he called it Vi Agnostics. And in this chapter, he gave me some new ideas. He gave me a beginning point at the finding of this power, and he changed my ideas about this God thing almost entirely on just a few simple pages. Thank God that he was a real alcoholic.
Remember back on page 10 when Bill was presented with this solution, and he said that his mind had snapped shut against such a theory, that there was a God personal to him, that his mind had snapped shut against such a theory, and certainly mine did too. This chapter of agnostic is a tremendous chapter for people like me, because the word agnostic itself tells me a lot of things. For instance, the word gnostic means knowledge, and you put the ag in front of it, it means without knowledge. And that's who I was. That means without, the ag means without. So I was a person who was without knowledge concerning God or spiritual matters, because I ran away from it when I was very young, and I too didn't have any desires to look at it again until I come to Alcoholics Anonymous. And when they presented me with this solution, my mind had snapped shut against all of those theories and all those thoughts that they talked about, and I just couldn't get it. My mind was closed to all spiritual concepts. It's just like it said. And I was talking to this fellow, and this guy, his name is Father Bill Wilson, Father Bill W. Some of you may know of Father Bill, tremendous AA member, lives in near San Diego. But Father Bill went off to the University of Rome at the age of 15. He was a very brilliant student. And there he was to study for 30 years of his life. And during those 30 years, he got 3 doctorates. And during those 30 years, you know that he has read some of the finest spiritual material that the world has ever seen, for a fact. And Father Bill told Charlie and I that this chapter to the agnostic was the greatest piece of spiritual information that he had ever read. That's quite a testimony coming from a man of his caliber. He said, this chapter is not here to prove to me that there was a God of any kind. He said, this chapter is here simply to open up my mind, ever so slightly, so that God might prove to me that there's a God. A whole new idea for me, a whole new way of looking at it. And he said for me to read this chapter, We Agnostics, with an open mind, very slowly think about each paragraph and each sentence in this book and what it might mean to me. And my mind would open up ever so slowly, and God would prove to me that there's a God. That's a whole new way of looking at things for me. And I love the chapter of We Agnostics. I love all the chapters, but I especially love the chapter of We Agnostics for that reason.
In the preceding chapters, you've learned something of alcoholism. We hope we've made clear the distinction between the alcoholic and the non-alcoholic. If when you honestly want to, you find you cannot quit entirely, or if when drinking you have little control over the amount you take, you are probably alcoholic. Isn't that great? God, how simple can you get? Just 2 little questions, that's all we need. If when drinking we have little control over the amount we take, that's because of the physical allergy. If we can't quit drinking entirely, that's because of the obsession of the mind. Then we are probably alcoholic. People today run themselves crazy trying to figure out whether they're alcoholic or not. Just ask yourself these 2 simple little questions. You see how people tend, though, to magnify and build upon things. The fellowship's not satisfied with these 2 questions. One time we had a pamphlet that had about 10 questions in it. Then we got one that's got 20 questions in it. And hell, now we got one that's got 44 questions in it.
Yeah.
And I'm sure glad that Ebby didn't have the 44 questions when he walked into Bill's kitchen. Old Bill sitting there hungover, sicker than hell. Ebby would have confused the hell out of him. He would have said, Bill, has your reputation been suffering from your alcoholism? He hadn't had a reputation in 3 or 4 or 5 years. Then he would have said, Bill, has alcohol been interfering with your sex life? If he's anything like I was, he hadn't had any of that in 3 or 4 years either. He would really have confused old Bill. We just need these 2 questions. We had an old friend lived down in Texas named Wino Joe. And Wino Joe had made up his own list to determine if you're alcoholic or not. And the first question on his list was this: has the roof of your mouth ever been sunburned?
Yeah.
He said if it has, you're probably alcoholic.
I like that one in the 44 question that says, do you drink alone? Now think about that. If I'm buying, yes, and if you're buying, no.
Now, if that be the case, you may be suffering from an illness which only a spiritual experience will conquer. We are very unique people. We number amongst a few people in the world today who have an illness of both the body and the mind that can only be overcome by a spiritual experience. We also number amongst a few people in the world today that have a terminal illness that we can come out of it in better shape than we were when we went into it if we can have the spiritual experience. Now, to one who feels he's an atheist or an agnostic, such an experience seems impossible. And that's exactly where I was. I didn't think I would be able to have the spiritual experience. So I had to stop right here and begin to look within my own mind and see what I really believed about God. And I said, Charlie, are you an atheist? And I said, no. An atheist is one who says there is no God, period. Now, if an atheist has no God, then he has no power greater than human power to turn to, and therefore he can't have a spiritual experience, he thinks, and he'll have to stand on his own 2 feet, run his own show. I said, no, I'm not an atheist. And then I said, well, are you an agnostic? And like Joe, I didn't know what that was. And I go to the dictionary and look it up, and I find that agnostic is one without any knowledge of God. An agnostic is one who believes, yeah, there might be a God, but since he's never had it proved to him, he just doesn't pay any attention to God. And he runs his own show, stands on his own 2 feet, rules his own destiny. He does the same thing that the atheist does. One says there is not, the other one says there probably is. The only difference between the two is one believes, the other one disbelieves. I said, Charlie, are you an agnostic? And I said, you bet your boots I am. I've always believed in God. But since I'd never had any proof that God would help me in my life, then I simply ignored God, so I really had no knowledge about God. But to continue as he means disaster, especially if he's an alcoholic of the hopeless variety. To be doomed to an alcoholic death,
Step 1.
or to live on a spiritual basis,
Step 2.
are not always easy alternatives to face, but it isn't so difficult. About half our original fellowship were of exactly that type. At first, some of us tried to avoid the issue, hoping against hope we were not true alcoholics. But after a while, we had to face the fact that we must find a spiritual basis of life or else. Perhaps it's going to be that way with you. but cheer up. Something like half of us thought we were atheists or agnostics, and our experience shows that you need not be disconcerted. And I think what Bill is saying here is it really doesn't make any difference what you believe when you come in here. You're still going to be able to have a vital spiritual experience, providing you're willing to do certain things. Now let's just look at a few words in this chapter, and let's kind of see some of these things that it's necessary for us to maybe change our belief on, and some of the things that it might be necessary for us to do in order to go from an atheist or an agnostic to a true believer. Now, a true believer is one who believes there is a God, receives God's power in their life, and they know that God exists. Most of us, I find, come here as agnostics. Most of us believe in some kind of God. We just don't pay much attention to it and run the show ourselves. How can we get from there to a true believer, one who believes in God, acts as if he does, and receives God's power? Page 45, first paragraph. Lack of power, that was our dilemma. We had to find a power by which we could live, and it had to be a power greater than ourselves, obviously. But where and how were we to find this power? My book is finally getting around to telling me what my real problem is. My real problem is a lack of power. Now, for those of us who are powerless, then how do we find that power? Well, that's exactly what this book is about. Its main object is to enable you to find a power greater than yourself, which will solve your problem. It doesn't say which will help you solve it, or which will enable you to solve it. It said the main object is to enable us to find the power, and then the power will solve the problem. I find it interesting enough from page 45 on, this book doesn't talk about alcohol hardly any at all anymore. It talks about one thing and one thing only. For those of us who are powerless, how do you find the power? Now, if I'm going to have to find the power, I've got to have some place at which to start the finding of the power. Joe?
On page 46, that very last paragraph, he said, much to our relief, we discovered we did not need to consider another's conception of God. Our own conception, however inadequate, was sufficient to make the approach and effective contact with Him. And as soon as we admitted the possible existence of a creative intelligence, a spirit of the universe underlying the totality of things, we began to be possessed of a new sense of power and direction, provided we took other simple steps. We found that God does not make too hard a turn for those who seek Him. To us, the realm of the Spirit is broad, roomy, all-inclusive, never exclusive or forbidding to those who earnestly seek Him. It is open, we believe, to all men, just like the fellowship of Alcoholics Anonymous is open to all men, never exclusive. We don't exclude anybody who are alcoholics from our fellowship. But in my early time in sobriety, my sponsor said to me, Joe, you're having lots of problems with this God thing, aren't you? And I said, yes, I am. He said, you don't have any conception of a loving God, do you? And I said, no, I don't. He said, well, in fact, I don't have hardly any conception of God, period, other than what I've told you already. And he said, Joe, why don't you do yourself a favor and do what I did? He said, why don't you go home tonight, take out a pencil and a piece of paper and write down some things that you would like God to be, knowing that you can't make God, but just write down some things that you would like God to be, forgetting all of those things that you think you know. What would you like God to be? And I went home that night and I wrote down some things, and I said, I would like God to be these things, and I kind of laid them out, and I'm not going to tell you what those are. To me, those are mine. And I took it back to him, and I said, George, this is what I would like God to be. And he said, good, you can start with that. I didn't know you could do that. The book gave me permission. It said, much to our relief, we discovered we did not need to consider another's conception of God. Our own conception, however inadequate, was sufficient to begin. And that's exactly what had happened to me. I made a little list that was sufficient to begin, and it wasn't much. And, and he said, you can do that. And boy, I mean, from what I knew of the God in the church that I went to, you couldn't do that. Because you had to believe what they believed. And if you didn't, you were in bad trouble, you see. As a matter of fact, when they used to come to my house sometimes years later to talk to me about what they believed, you know what I'd do with them? I'd run them off. I said, get out of my house and get out of my yard. Don't ever come back. That's the way I felt about it. I was totally antagonistic towards those people. Very, very sick man when I got here. So on page 47 it says, when therefore we speak to you of God, we mean your own conception. This applies too to other spiritual expressions which you find in this book. Do not let any prejudice you may have against spiritual terms deter you from honestly asking yourself what they mean to you. At the start, this was all that we needed to commit spiritual growth, to effect our first conscious relation with God as we understood Him. And then afterward, we found ourselves accepting many things which then seemed entirely out of reach. But that was growth. But if we wished to grow, we had to begin somewhere. So we used our own conception, however limited it was, and mine was definitely limited.
So the first new idea I got from this chapter was the idea that I could have my own conception of God. That if I didn't want Him to be hellfire and brimstone, He didn't have to be. And I'm like Joe, I didn't know you could have this kind of idea. Hell, this was blasphemy. I thought you'd go to hell for believing that. Thank God we've been able to change our belief about God from that old punishing God to an entirely different kind of God. That's the first thing that I've got out of this thing, which is positive for me.
Now we need to ask ourselves but one short question. Do I now believe?
The agnostic has always believed in some kind of God.
Or am I even willing to believe?
The atheist can become willing to believe in some kind of God.
That there's a power greater than myself. And as soon as a man can say that he does believe,
which is the agnostic,
or is willing to believe,
which is the atheist,
we emphatically assure him that he's on his way. It has been repeatedly proven among us that upon this simple cornerstone, a wonderfully effective spiritual structure can be built. Again, the asterisk, bottom of the page, please be sure to read Appendix 2 on spiritual experiences. For people like me, please read that and understand what we're trying to tell you.
I want to be absolutely sure that we understand what that spiritual experience is, and this time they've tied it together with the asterisk to a wonderfully effective spiritual structure. So the wonderfully effective spiritual structure that we're going to build, this vital spiritual experience, the beginning of that is to believe or become willing to believe, and we're already on the way to recovery. And he said that was great news for us. For we'd assume we could not make use of spiritual principles unless we accepted many things on faith which seemed difficult to believe. Now right here he separated the words faith and belief. And I've always had trouble with these two words. Faith implies knowledge. Faith implies after the fact information. Now the minister always said, son, all you got to do is have faith. Well, I never could have faith because I didn't know whether God would do those things for me or not. I'd never even tried. How could I possibly know? And the book says I don't have to have faith, that all I got to have is belief. Belief is upfront information. Belief is nothing more than suspicion. Let me give you an example of it. Let's say I moved into your neighborhood and 2 or 3 months from now I've got trouble with my automobile. And I come to you and I say, look, I got a problem with my car and I don't know a good mechanic anywhere in this area. Can you help me? And you'll probably say, well, sure. Take your car over there to John. John will do you a good job, charge you a reasonable price. Now, I don't know whether that's true or not. The best I can possibly do with that information is if I believe it's strong enough, I'll take my car to John. John does a good job on it, charges me a reasonable price, and when I leave there, I know he'll do that. Now, 6 months from now, I have trouble with my automobile again. This time I take it straight back to John. I don't ask you or anybody else. The first time I went to John on belief. The second time I went to John on faith. Certain things have to transpire between belief and faith before you can really have these two things. They are two entirely separate, different things. It was very comforting to me to know that I don't have to have faith. All I got to do is believe. And as an agnostic, I've always believed that there is a power greater than I am. And from there I can start. That's the second thing I learned about this thing. Now, if I'm going to need the power, and if I know that the starting of that power is simply to believe, then the next thing I'll need to know is what procedure am I going to follow to find that power. Let's go to page 51.
The first paragraph, it says, this world of ours has made more material progress in the last century than all the millenniums which went before. Almost everyone knows the reasons. Students of ancient history tell us that the intellect of men in those days was equal to the best of today. Yet in ancient times, material progress was painfully slow. The spirit of modern scientific inquiry, research, and invention was almost unknown. You know, I used to think that we today were a lot smarter than those people 100 years ago, 200, 500, thousands of years ago. But I know today that we all have the same intellect. And this intellect means the capacity to learn. The only problem was with those people in way back when, in 100 years ago and 200 years ago, which says here that in the realm of material, men's minds were fettered by superstition, tradition, and all sorts of fixed ideas. And whenever you have superstition, tradition, and all sorts of fixed ideas, and you have a bunch of old ideas, you can't move forward, progress forward in any manner. And that's exactly what had happened to me. You see, I had a lot of old tradition, all those superstitions, and all sorts of fixed ideas, and therefore I stayed where I was, and I couldn't grow spiritually. I had to lay all those things aside as they did. And we've learned to do that in this last 50 or 75 years in our country. We're very free thinkers today, thank God, I believe, in many, many areas. And we're making progress in lots and lots of areas, too.
You know, this goes right back to that same old word, belief. And it's such an important word in our lives. The only way you can ever change anything is to first change what you believe. If you believe the same, you'll stay the same. And the only way you can ever change is to believe you can do so. Now, 1,000 years ago, superstition, tradition, and fixed ideas kept people from believing differently. And therefore, they could not develop any of the new things that we know today. You know, it was only about 200 years ago In the United States, in the northeastern part, they were burning people at the stake. And they were burning them at the stake because they dared to believe differently, and they called them witches, and they killed them. Now, if they're going to burn you at the stake for believing differently, then you're not going to believe different. And if you do, you're sure not going to say anything about it. And therefore, they could never develop any of these new things that we have today. Now, it's only within the last 100 years that we put superstition, tradition, and fixed ideas aside, and we begin to believe that we could do this, we begin to believe we could do that, we begin to believe we could do something else, and we acted upon the beliefs, and sure enough, we've got our airplanes, we've got our microwave ovens, we've got our computers, we've got our hair dryers, and I could sit here and name literally thousands of things we've invented within the last 100 years, and the only reason we've done it is because we were allowed to believe differently. You can only start with belief. You can't know. But if you're going to change anything, you've got to change what you believe. Step 2 said we came to believe. It does not say we came to know. We came to believe based upon what other people told us, that if they could change, maybe we could change also. He said even the contemporaries of Columbus thought a round earth preposterous. You know, as silly as it may seem, 500 years ago, nearly everybody in what they then called the civilized world were centered around the Mediterranean Sea and the western shores of Europe. And they had found a place called the East Indies. And the East Indies, they had gold, silk, and spices and all the goody-goodies of life. And the only way they could get there, though, was to sail to the northeast end of the Mediterranean, then go by land, camelback, horseback, footback, or however they traveled. And it took literally years to make that trip and get back. And they wanted the gold and the silk and the spices and the goody-goodies faster, so they were looking for a new trade route to the East Indies where they could get there faster. And somebody said, is there any way we could sail a ship there? And they said, no, dummy. Don't you know that the only way you can do is sail to the northeast end of the Mediterranean and go by land? He said, yeah, but what if we sail the other way? And he said, well, idiot, you'd sail right off the edge of this sucker. Don't you know that the world is flat? And if you sail out there, you'll sail off the edge. They all believed that in those days. I don't know why they believed it. I guess some people sailed out there, didn't come back. They assumed that they sailed off the edge of it. Now here come Columbus. And Columbus had to be alcoholic. This is all there is to it. He had to be alcoholic. You got to be stubborn and bull-headed to believe differently than everybody else in the world, and then have guts enough to stand there and express that belief in the face of everybody else's denial. Columbus said, I don't believe this thing is flat. I believe it is round. Then he made one of the most drunk statements the world's ever heard. He said, I believe we could get east by sailing west. Now, if that isn't drunk thinking, I don't know what is. Many of his mannerisms indicated he's alcoholic. When he left, he didn't know where he was going. When he got there, he didn't know where he was. And when he got back, he didn't even know where he had been. That's surely alcoholic. But what really, really made him an alcoholic is a woman financed the whole trip for him, too.
Twice.
Now, Columbus followed a little formula.
You write down these key words because they're extremely important.
Columbus followed a little formula that the world has always known, that you need to follow it if you want to change anything, period. The first thing you got to do to change something is to be willing to change it. You can't keep doing the same things you've always done and change. You got to be willing to change. Circumstances made him willing to change. Trying to find the new trade route to the East Indies made him willing to begin to consider that the world is round, that it's not flat, and you won't sail off the edge of it. Second thing you have to do to change anything is to believe you can do so. And Columbus said, I believe we can get east by sailing west. Yeah. The third thing you got to do is you got to make a decision about it. Now, the day Columbus expressed his belief, he's still standing on the shore of the ocean. And that belief didn't do him a bit of good. But some days, weeks, months, years later, he made a decision. He said, by golly, I'm going to go find out whether this thing is round or flat, whether you can really get east by sailing west. But you know, his decision didn't do him any good either, because he's still standing on the shore of the ocean the day he expressed it. Some days, weeks, months, years later, Columbus began to take some action. He first went to the king of Portugal to get the money. And the king, being an astute businessman, said, Columbus, there's no way I'm going to let you have this money. He said, if I do, you'll sail right out there, sail off the edge of this sucker, I'll get nothing back. That's why he ended up with the Queen of Spain. He sweet-talked her out of the money on the promises that he would bring back the gold, the silk, the spices. She gave him the money. He took that money and he bought 3 ships. He put provisions in those 3 ships. He put crew members in those 3 ships. And they began to go east by sailing west, taking the action necessary. Day after day after day after day, they sailed straight west. Now, we don't know for sure. But we like to imagine that Columbus probably hired on his first trip a special sailor, put him on the bow of the lead ship at night with a lantern, whispered in his ear, and said, I believe this thing is round, but if you see the edge of this damn thing, you holler so we can get turned around. You see, he doesn't know, he just believes. Now, after they sailed west day after day after day after day, eventually they got results. They found land on the other side. Now, he thought he found the East Indies. Today we know it was the West Indies. But what he did, he proved to himself that the world is not flat, it is round. You won't sail off the edge of it. He got results from the action that he took. He turned right around and came right back to the Queen of Spain. She said, Columbus, where's the gold, silk, and spices you promised you would bring me? And he said, sweetheart, I didn't find any. But he said, I tell you what I'll do. If you'll refinance me, I'll go back, and this time I'll find it. And she refinanced him, and he got more ships, more provisions, more crew members, began to go east by sailing west with one big difference. He didn't hire the special sailor and put him on the bow of the lead ship at night with a lantern because he knew the world was round. You won't sail off the edge of it. He went back on faith. Now, certain things had to take place. He had to become willing. He had to believe. He had to decide. He had to act. He had to get results. And then he knew. And he went from belief to faith by following that simple little formula. Now, I'd like to tell you today that the 12 steps of Alcoholics Anonymous are brand new. The world's never seen anything like them. But if I did, I'd tell you the lie, because they're based on the same formula. In step 1, you and I become willing to change. When we can see that what we're doing is no longer going to work for us, we become willing to change in step 1. Step 2, we believe we can do so, that there's a power greater than ourselves can restore us to sanity. Step 3, we make a decision regarding that power. In step 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, and 11, we take action. In step 12, we get the results. Having had a spiritual awakening as the result of these steps, we no longer believe, today we know. You see, I don't believe God will restore me to sanity. Today I know that He will because He's done so. And He did so by me following the same formula that Columbus used. Same identical thing, just put together in words that we alcoholics can accept them in our lives, and we can make those changes also by following that same identical formula. Isn't this a simple little idea? I don't have to be worried about who God is and who He isn't. I don't have to be worried about any of that stuff. All I need to be worried about is, do I believe there's a power greater than I am? If there is, I need to make a decision about that power, and then I need to take the action. And then sooner or later, I'm going to find out one way or the other, but I'll never find out until I take the action necessary to do so. Isn't that great? Now, if you know you need the power, and you know that the starting of the finding of the power is to believe, and if you know the formula to find the power, you just need to know one more thing. Where are we going to find that power? And I think we get here just as confused about where God is as we ever were about who God is. You know, as a kid growing up, I got a picture of God in my mind. I don't know whether I saw it or dreamed it, but in my mind, God was a tall, elderly gentleman standing on a cloud up in the sky, long flowing white robes on, long white hair, golden halo around his head, sun rays shooting out of it, and a big stick in his right hand. Now, I don't know where I got that picture. I think maybe one of the reasons I got that picture of God is because every time the minister talked about God, he always pointed up there, and I knew God had to be there somewhere. But what really confused me, I also noticed in church that every time the minister talked to God, he always looked down here. And he pointed. No wonder we get confused as kids growing up about God. I never knew where God was until I came to the big book Alcoholics Anonymous and read page 55. And it tells me exactly where I'm going to find Him.
There's a little story I like to tell about page 55 that really helped me. It changed my life. I was working with this fellow several years ago, and he was living in a halfway house, and he'd asked me to be his sponsor, and he said, what do you think I ought to do? And I said, well, it'd be a good idea if you got a job, for one thing, be self-supporting. He said, well, easy for you to say. You have a car, and I don't. He said, I could get a job if I had a car. I had a way to get around. We don't have much of a transit system in Tulsa. And I said, well, I'll take you around till you find you a job, and I'll take you back and forth until you get a paycheck or two. And he said, fine. So I did, and he found a job. I took him back and forth, and one morning on the way to work, all this time I'm thinking I'm helping him. Well, he told me this little story that helped me, you see. And he told me this little story the way he went. He said it was about the 3 wise men of the East, the way he put it. They stole from man the crown of life, the thing that would make man the happiest. And now they determine what they're going to do with it. Well, one of them said, I'll tell you what we'll do. We'll take it to the highest mountain on the face of the earth, and we'll hide it in the highest crevice, and they'll never think about looking for it there. The other two said, yeah, but you know how they are. They'll hunt and they'll search and they'll eventually find it. The other one said, I'll tell you what we'll do. We'll take it to the deepest, deepest ocean. We'll hide it in the deepest, deepest crevice in the ocean. They'll never be able to find it there. And the other two said, yeah, but you know how they are. They're cunning, they're baffling, they're powerful. They'll hunt and they'll search and they'll eventually find it. And the third one said, I'll tell you what we'll do. We'll hide it within himself, and he'll never think about looking for it there.
Let's go to the first paragraph on page 55.
So actually, we were fooling ourselves.
No, the first paragraph.
Oh, excuse me. Yet we were been seeing another kind of flight, a spiritual liberation from this world, people who rose above their problems. They said God made these things possible, and we only smiled. We had seen spiritual release, but like to tell ourselves it wasn't true. Actually, we were fooling ourselves. For deep down in every man, woman, and child is a fundamental idea of God. It may be obscured by calamity, by pomp, by worship of other things, but in some form or other it's there. For faith in a power greater than ourselves and miraculous demonstrations of that power in human lives are facts as old as man himself. We finally saw that faith in some kind of a God was a part of our makeup, just as much as the feelings we have for a friend. Sometimes we had to search fearlessly, but he was there, and he was as much a fact as we were. We found the great reality deep down within us. In the last analysis, it is only there that he may be found. It was so with us.
It seems as though each one of us, every human being, seems to have somewhere deep within inside ourselves, probably at a subconscious level, some form of knowledge that seems to be able to tell us what we should do and what we shouldn't do, that seems to be able to tell us how we should live and how we shouldn't live, that seems to be able to tell us how we should treat our fellow man and not treat our fellow man. Now, some people might want to refer to that as innate intelligence. Some people might want to call it common sense. Others might want to call it the conscience, and I'm sure some would call it the soul. I don't think it really makes any difference what we call it, as long as we realize that it's there. And it's always been there, as far back as I can remember. Now, there used to be times that I'd be getting ready to do something, and some voice from somewhere within me would say to me, Charlie, I don't believe you ought to be doing this. And I wouldn't pay a bit of attention to it. I'd go right ahead and do it and get in one hell of a mess. And that same little voice would say, see, I told you not to do that in the first place. Now, if that's true, and if that's God, then what that means to me today is if God dwells within me, then I've got my own personal God. I don't have to worry about whether he's the God of the Baptist church or not. I don't worry about whether he's the God of the Catholic Church, the Hebrew religion, or anybody else's religion. If he dwells within me, he's my own personal God. And he and I can come together in very simple, understandable terms. I didn't know that you could believe this. I thought you'd go to hell if you believed this. See, this is another brand new idea for me. Now then, with these new ideas about God that I've got out of this chapter, I'm just about ready to make a decision. But based on old ideas of hellfire and brimstone, there's no way I could have made that decision. Bill Wilson knew exactly what I was going to think. And he put this chapter in here to give me some new ideas so I could start toward the finding of God and make my decision and get on with the rest of the program. Without this chapter, I'm stymied. If you got any trouble with God, your belief about God or anything else, read this chapter very carefully. Read it on the basis that maybe some of the old ideas we've had are not correct, and maybe we can pick up some new ideas. It's a lead pipe cinch that based on old ideas, we're probably not going to be able to do anything. Fits exactly where it belongs.
The book said we can only clear the ground a bit. If our testimony helps sweep away prejudice, enables you to think honestly, encourages you to search diligently within yourself, then if you wish, you can join us on the broad highway. With this attitude, you cannot fail. The conscience of your belief is sure to come to you. See, all I have to do is think about it, and to wonder about it, and to think about it, and to wonder about it. And you know, by the thinking and the wondering about it, then God will reveal himself to me within inside. And if it's true that there's some little voice within me that tells me when I'm about to do something wrong, then there's a little voice within me that's going to tell me what to do, what's right, too. Because the opposite has to be true. And I believe that that's God within me that will direct my life. And we're getting ready to think about that in a little bit and after how it works.